So I'm delighted to say that today we are meeting someone who is here simply because the technology has expanded our horizons. And we've had commentators on from all over the world. Today, we're off in Melbourne with the wonderful Ian Forth. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, Messi.
So one of the things we're trying to do is give people some understanding, some background around the people that they're hearing on air. And so my invitation to you would be just to tell us a bit about Ian, particularly the young Ian Forth, and how he came into sport and cricket and what it meant to you.
Yes, okay, well, thank you. Yes, born in Coventry. My father was a Geordie. He came down from the shipyards because there were no more shipyards looking for work. So he came down and started working in the car industry in Coventry. That was still going just about in the 60s and 70s. So I was born in 62. And my mother, as was tradition in those days, you had to stop work as soon as you got married. She worked in a bank, then she had to stop work. And that was the world of those days. She became a housewife. And so that was my geographical background. We were big, my father and I used to go and watch the Coventry City team in the 1970s, which was the beginning of a, I won't say a love-hate relationship, but certainly an experience with dallying with relegation for the next 40 years. So that was so much the football side of things. And I still, got a great interest in football. And of course, living in Australia, as we'll come on to, it's much easier to follow all sports these days. So I can even watch my beloved Coventry City from my lounge room these days.
So you are a masochist.
Yes, exactly. We are all in one way or another, aren't we? So with cricket, I'm not trying to remember. My father was interested in cricket, but he wasn't sort of besotted with it. But I think very often you just have one day, 1 week, one summer when you become really, really interested in it. And I think for me, it was the 1972 Ashes. Yeah. Of course, in those days, it was on terrestrial TV. And fixed camera from behind one of the wickets, not great coverage, but for me it was gold. And I wasn't the most sociable of children. I'm sure you're probably getting a bit of a thread of this from some of your interviewees. So I was quite happy, rather sadly in some ways, but sort of happily in another, to sort of sit down in front of the TV almost that entire summer and just watch all five. And it turned out to be a great series. It was 2-2 in the end. It was quite low scoring. And then you got introduced to sort of various characters of the game. And you could really engage over a 5-test series. Yeah. Tony Gregg, I think that was his first home series. Jeff Boycott was obviously a fascinating character. There was the whole Basil D'Oliveira thing going back. There's a whole sort of backstory there with the apartheid thing. Yeah. There was little Alan Knott behind the stumps with his handkerchief coming out of his back pocket. All these characters. And then there was these grizzled Aussies who were, and they weren't the enemy as such. They sort of created the drama. There was sort of grizzly old Ian Chappell and gambling, smoking Doug Walters. And then there are some characters, and there's always some characters in the series that come and go, and you hardly ever hear from them again. Who's ever heard of Bruce Francis again after that?
Oh, yes, that's true.
So it's a bit, I'm sort of a great novel reader as well. And it was a bit like, a 5-test series, if it's really good and really engaging, is a bit like reading a long novel, the interplay between the characters and the resolution. And some of it doesn't get fully resolved either. And I thought, after all that, it was 2-2.
So that's a very mature perspective. Well, what were you, an 11-year-old at the time?
Yeah, so what would I be? 10. I was 10. 10. I was 16.
At least you had a TV. When I spoke to Hendo, his mum and dad didn't have a TV, so he had to go down to the local rediffusion shop and stand in front of the window to watch at the age of 9, which
that's wonderful. Impressive. I do remember not having a TV, but I think we got one when I was about 4.
Right.
Oh, mate, I think we got it for the 66 World Cup final, but I was slightly too young for that. But I do remember colour TV. coming in. And it was, we're only 3 or 4 years into colour TV in 72, and it was still had a novelty about it.
Oh dear. So did you get a chance to play yourself?
Yes, I did. So yes, I was a bit of a skinny teenager, but the one thing, really the only sporting thing I was ever good at, I was quite a good bowler. And I ended up opening the bowling for the first 11 for my school, which was the grammar school in Coventry, King Henry VIII. So I was always quite proud of that. I think it gives you a bit of an identity in the school as well, if you're playing for the first 11. So that was quite nice, quite flattering. Not sure that playing cricket gets the girls, though, I have to say.
But I think, hasn't Henry VIII produced a few famous cricketers over the years?
Well, no, not really. It's produced a lot of rugby players.
That maybe
David Duckham, Peter Rossborough, Peter Breese, and people like that, and guys like Chris Millerchip and Andy Savage, Brian Kidner, more recent times. But it produced one cricketer back in the 1930s called Wyatt, R.E.S. Wyatt, who probably not many people have even heard of these days. But he said of all his experience in cricket, the one time he learned absolutely nothing was at school. So,
so did that apply to you as well?
Well, I think cricket in the old sort of grammar school system, it was really for the rugby guys to have a bit of fun during the summer months. It wasn't taken that seriously. For me, it was the sort of pinnacle of the year because I was hopeless at rugby. But the coaching wasn't great.
Yeah.
But it was fun, I actually, very unfortunately, the following year I was in my gap year and I turned out for the company. It was actually IBM, and I was coming into bowl and buggered my ACL.
Oh,
wow. And you could hear it go crack, and I thought I'd gone into the wicket and hit it. But it's a funny injury, an ACL. It's not hugely painful. You can sort of limp off and you think, oh, I'll run this off in a week or two.
Yeah.
But in those days, there was no operation for it. So that was really, apart from some very casual cricket, that was the end of my glorious cricketing career. Not that it would have been any more glorious after that. Of course, it would only ever have been social.
So you were stuffed for life, basically, were you?
Yeah. So I mean, these days there's proper operations for it and rehab and things. But in those days, I mean, I can still jog, but I can't really run. I can play family tennis and things like that. But that's the sort of extent of it. And bowling is one thing that would be absolutely out of the question because of the very, that odd action. Even as a spinner, it would have been almost too difficult to do.
Yeah, the twisting involved.
The twisting, exactly. Yeah, that's the one thing. When you've got the cruciate ligaments, there's no give in your knee.
Yeah, I've got a crap left knee, and every now and then it gives way on me, and that was a good excuse for being really bad at pitching the ball in the right place.
So are you still, what was your, I mean, you've probably mentioned this as well, but what was your cricketing experience?
Well, I wasn't very good. I was the sort of cricketer who was absolutely passionate about it, but whose talent didn't come anywhere close to their aspirations. So both at prep school and at public school, I was ended up being captain of the second 11. Captain of the second 11 is a position given to someone who's really keen but not very good, and they know that they're never going to be in the first 11. So
that's right.
Always be there. Before being captain, I was, of course, scorer for the first 11, which
yes,
it's sort of, so it's a bit sad, but it was I just adored cricket.
It's funny, isn't it? I don't know what is it about it. It sort of attracts. Well, we like sport, yes, of course, but there is something both about the narrative and all the backstories and all the data, and it's so nuanced, isn't it? There's nothing you can't stop learning about cricket. There's always a new aspect. There's always just some development or evolution of the game. It's very traditional, but it never stands still either.
Well, yes and no, because really the fundamentals remain pretty much the same, but people find different ways to discuss them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's improvement in a whole lot of things, but when it comes down to it, 99.9% of people who actually play the game are pretty crap at it.
Yes.
and enjoy the social side of it, and enjoy just being part of a team.
There is would you say there is a difference between the Australian and the English attitude? Maybe you can't remember, maybe you didn't experience sort of social cricket in England. You may have come to
I
us.
didn't.
But it's really, the emphasis is very much on the social with weekend cricket of office workers and so forth.
I think for most cricket in Australia, that's probably the case. I mean, there's very good grade competitions in most states here, and they do get very competitive. But the truth is that, the first grade team may get really competitive. By the time you get down to the 7th 11, it's a matter of playing anybody who happens to turn up on the day.
Yes.
And you make sure you never drop the person who brings the best afternoon teas. And I think that's pretty universal when it comes to cricket.
I've got one of my three sons retains his interest in cricket. He actually played. He doesn't really started work now, and he's going through that period of girlfriends and so forth when cricket takes a bit of a backseat. Yeah, we still went to the days 1 and 2 of the Melbourne Test just gone. That was fantastic to catch up with him. But he used to play senior cricket when he was a mid 15-year-old or whatever. Yeah. And that was a great introduction to the adult world.
Yeah, well, I mean, at that age in the clubs, there are some very competitive young men who really, really want to get somewhere. I think it's an age thing as well. If you're playing cricket when you're 30, unless you're at the top tier, then you're there because it's a social occasion. It's a good fun thing. And it was not Fred was saying to me, he said, it's not so much about winning, it's about really enjoying yourself.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. There, it's there's a lot of sort of mental health issues and so on around these days, which is much more. Well, it was always there. It's just talked about now, which is good in itself. But men's cricket is a good way of forming a community as well at its best. Yeah. There can be downsides. It can be arguably with alcohol and things. Sometimes people say, well, that there's some negatives involved, but I think overall the positives are overwhelming.
Yeah. So you stopped being a player in your late teens, but you presumably kept the connection with the game through following it and going to watch it?
Yes, absolutely. So I started working. I had a brief dalliance in Newcastle where I worked for Procter and Gamble, who are the soap and detergent people, and then I came.
Were you always in marketing?
So I was in marketing up there, and then I switched sides. I went from sort of gamekeeper to poacher, or whatever the phrase is, and became an advertising agent for the next 30 years, along with Grubby, who some people listening will know very well, Paul Howarth. We were in the same agency. So I worked at an agency called Bose Massimi Pollitt, BMP, for nearly 20 years in London. And for those who are capable of remembering these things, if you remember the Smash Martians or the Cresta Bear or the Heineken Bear, we had a great sort of menagerie of animals we used to run with our campaigns. And then sort of in latter years, since I left, the famous John Lewis ads came out of the same building, which are probably the most famous ads in the world these days. So that was a wonderful agency to be associated with. It was probably the best agency of the 90s.
The days of long lunches and
100%, yes. I mean, I actually joined advertising in 87, which was probably the absolute high point of long lunches. We had sort of various. I couldn't believe it, actually, because the client world is much more austere and, you work quite hard as a client. Yeah. I couldn't believe the world I was entering in 1987 in advertising. I mean, there was the saying that it wasn't a proper lunch unless you had dinner in the same restaurant.
And it was all a tax write-off as well.
Well, it was. I had no idea how the finances worked. But I mean, for those who are the sort of footnote of history, for those who are interested, basically, it was because advertising worked on a commission system in those days. So you could write an ad and then you got a commission for whenever it ran on air. Well, ads used to run sometimes for years and years and years. So you could be still picking up say if you were run an ad in Coronation Street that you wrote 5 years ago, isn't it? And you get paid cost £30,000 for the client to run. And the agency got 10% of that. Well, you're just sitting there in the evening. The agency get £3,000 just for doing absolutely nothing 5 years after you did the work. It was a beautiful system. But unfortunately, as all good things come to an end, the commission system was what broke advertising, and then moved to a retainer system and then a fee system. It was all designed to stop those long lunches, I'm afraid.
And they brought in things like KPIs and all those dreadful things.
Yes, dreadful world. And then, of course, there was the digital revolution. No one's ever really been able to work out how advertising should work since. There's this wonderful 50 years of TV advertising, and then since then it's all gone to hell. But
are you still working in that area, or?
I don't know how to describe it. I've been freelancing for the last 4 years, but I just sort of take the jobs that I quite like nowadays, and I've got a few friends who I trust to sort of pass me on work.
Yeah.
So I sort of avoid the unpleasant stuff and just do jobs which look interesting now. So I'm very lucky.
You certainly are. I mean, that's pretty much anybody's dream in terms of work.
Exactly. Yes.
And to do it from Melbourne, where you don't have to put up with an English winter, is even better.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. Yes. Let me see now. I suppose when we're sort of carrying on the cricket story, there was a great crossover I had once between. I wrote a piece for Guerrilla Cricket some time ago, but. I was sort of sitting at my desk in 2001. I used to do quite a lot of research for the agency as well. And what landed on my desk ultimately was a brief from the ECB, from the English Cricket Board. Because in 2001, English cricket was at one of its many low points, and was not dissimilar perhaps to exactly where it is 20 years later, but it was deciding how do we rescue the game, really, because attendances were falling, people were getting less interested in test matches, the one-day side was absolutely hopeless. It was in many ways worse, because at least we've got a decent one-day side with England these days. So they said, well, let's do some research, go and find out what people think. And for one reason and another, I won't bore you with the details, but it landed on my desk because that was fantastic. I spent most of August and September that year going up and down the county grounds, interviewing people on the boundary rope about what they thought about the game and what was right with it, what was wrong with it. Did a lot of focus groups and so on, and then reported back to Lord Maclaurin, as it was in those days, and the ECB and the First Class Forum, which was First Class Forum was the 16 chief executives and the 16 chairmen of the 16, as it was then. Counties. So it was, as a cricket nerd, it was a very interesting project, but fascinating to have the curtain lifted on behind the scenes. And as they always say, if you like biscuits, don't go and tour the biscuit factory. And it was a little bit like that. Goodness, these people are in charge of the game. I don't believe it.
Did they take any notice of what you had to say to them?
Well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So the one big outcome, it was never the focus of the project, but it turned out that way, was the old Benson and Hedges, which some people might remember, trophy was coming to the end of its sponsorship in a year's time. So they were wondering how to fill the gap.
So just for people who don't know, what was the Benson Hedges trophy?
So there were 2 one-day trophies, the old Nat West, which was the prime one. Well, there were 3, actually. There was a Sunday League as well, the old John Player League. And there was one in between called the it was just one of the 3 one-day trophies. There was a knockout competition like the League Cup in football.
Yeah.
It was to fill the schedule, and one-day cricket was quite financially lucrative for the counties. But there was no obvious replacement of sponsorship. And that was what was really probably driving the project, because they're thinking, well, we can't get decent sponsors these days. So there was this thing they'd heard about down in South Africa called 20-a-side cricket. And there was a guy called Stuart Robertson who worked into, the name escapes me, but he was the marketing manager at the ECB. And he was a very forward-looking guy. And we worked, my friend Al Crawford, who did the project with, we worked very closely with him. And he had at the back of his mind, this might be an opportunity to introduce a really short form game. And where the research which I did was helpful was saying it's not so much that people are bored with cricket, but they can't access it. They don't know what the schedule is. I showed them a county cricket website, which was in itself quite new then, where you couldn't find the fixture list. I mean,
I reckon you could probably find one of those today.
So we agreed that what was needed was to find a way of getting cricket into the modern person's lifestyle. And of course, compared to 20 or 30 years ago, the role of the husband or the father in a nuclear family or in a non-nuclear family was quite different. They were expected, these days, it seems they're expected to actually be present on a Sunday and take the kids to Alton Towers, or at the very least take them to the local park. They weren't expected to bugger off and watch by themselves and watch a one-day match somewhere. So hence we said, well, let's carve out Tuesday evenings in the middle of summer and do what blokes have been doing, and increasingly now women, but blokes in those days essentially, and meet after work at 5:30. And for those guys who don't play cricket, get them to spend 3 hours watching the match. They can have some drinks, they can have a bit of fun. And that was launched eventually in 2003. They were very lucky with the weather that year, turned into a huge success. But of course, England being England.
Was that 20 overs a side?
That was the beginning of 20 over cricket.
No, it wasn't the beginning. I mean, I recall it in the 50s, going to watch my dad of an evening playing 20 over cricket. But
that's exactly it, Messi. It was just a replication of what people had been doing after work since the dawn of time, really.
Yeah,
just turned it into the county game. It was never really intended to be anything other than a gap filler, really, in the schedule to replace an old one-day competition that had run its course.
Yeah.
But the law of unintended consequences, it turned into an absolutely huge success that first summer. And the ECB realised, well, we're onto a bit of a winner here. And of course, in a sense, the rest is history. And of course, England being England, having sort of, I won't say invented it because they didn't invent it, but they popularised it initially. And then they've let other people, the IPL, take it up and commercialise it. That's the history of English inventions for the last 200 years. Really.
So basically, you're to blame.
Yes.
Yes.
I do feel very guilty about this. If I'd have just written a report back in 2001 said there's no future for this, then none of this would have happened.
It's really interesting, isn't it, in terms of just watching the way those things move, especially for you as a marketing person to see the various influences on it and the demands. And you couldn't have imagined then the dollars that were going to come through TV rights.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you asked the question, what were the recommendations, I think, and there were other recommendations. For example, things which should have been acted on then if someone had listened, such as what you really need to be doing is an outreach to your ethnic communities.
Yep.
Because there was one guy I interviewed on the Boundary Edge. He was Muslim. And he said, well, have a look here. I'll just take you. And we had to look. There's a burger van and there's another burger van. That's no good to me. I'm a Muslim. So what am I going to eat if I come here? And that was practically a problem, but it was also symbolically a problem of people of an organization that wasn't interested. And of course, 20 years later, that's all come back to the surface.
Yes.
With, as is well rehearsed, with the fact that it's a middle to upper class run, white run sport, which doesn't reach out and understand its audience well enough. And we honestly came back with these recommendations, and there were smiles and nods and some laughter about, oh yes, well, maybe one day kind of thing around the room. And that was all put into the filing cabinet. The one thing they were interested in was 2020 cricket. So that's the one that took off.
It's fascinating. I reckon over the next few weeks, the Sydney Test match starts, as we're recording this, starts tomorrow. and I'm sure it's going to rain a bit. I reckon this is ripe for further discussion, because I'd love to dig deeper into some of this with you, Forthy, but
Yeah.
given the limits, I want to move on a bit.
Yeah, sure.
So you you'd had connection with Grubby, and you decided to come to Australia eventually. When was that?
Yeah, so 2005, we had a young family, had 5-year-old twins and an 8-year-old, 3 boys. So we decided, well, so back one step in the family history, my wife grew up in Australia, and I think we talked about this once before. She came from a family of old colonials, so to speak, and part of her upbringing had been, slightly bizarrely, her father was, I think the correct term is superintendent of the Aboriginal community, as it was.
That's right. Yes.
Up on Melville Island when she was a year. So she grew up with the Indigenous folk up on Melville Island, which, for those people who don't know, is a massive island north of Darwin. And she didn't see any white people for 4 years. They were the only white people on the island. Then she spent a couple of years in Brisbane. Anyway, she always wanted to come back to Australia. Her brother had moved back to Australia. We felt at that point in 2005, the children were a good age. They were old enough to remember it. We probably assumed we weren't going to stay that long. And young enough so if we went back to England, they could still make their teenage friendship groups, and not too much had been lost from that point of view. As it happened, we came over in 2005, and we've stayed since. So that's 16 years ago.
You fell in love with Melbourne, basically.
Yeah, I mean, Melbourne is, for those who don't know it, it's an unusually brilliant city. To be honest, it's got a bit of everything. It loves its sport. When in doubt, they build a new stadium here. But it's not just sports mad. It's got a cultural and arts scene as well. Loves its music. Many festivals, and there's a lot of good venues, and I'm interested in music as well. But it's kind of the best of everything. You've got good weather. Possibly the temperatures are a bit too extreme. Rather like you, we get our 43-degree days, but we also get our sort of 10-degree days, and too many of them. So it's very volatile. But that's a small price to pay, really. You never get those kind of low grey skies that last a month like you do in London.
The dark satanic mills. So when did you first come into connection with guerrilla cricket?
Not long ago, actually, Messi. So I'd worked with Grubby many years before, and then we somewhat kept in touch. And then I've done a music podcast for the last 4 or so years. Which
tell us about that a bit.
Yeah, okay. Well, I rarely need a second invitation, I must admit. So that's called Sombrero Fallout. So that was, for those people who remember the old John Peel, who was a kind of legendary DJ, a late night DJ who introduced us to many bands for the first time, Sex Pistols, Clash, Joy Division, but also lots of different types of music like reggae. Most people probably listening to this will at least have heard of him. I was always a great aficionado of his, and when podcasts came along and made it possible, I thought, well, I'll find out how to do one and experiment a bit. So I did. The theme was alternative music, intriguing themes. So I pick a different theme each time, whether it's a city or a type of music or an artist or a record label or just a theme, and do an hour playing the music and talking about it. That's more or less it. It's a fairly simple idea, but we're up to sort of 97 episodes now, which I didn't think would happen, which is nice. And we've got a sort of loyal following around the world. And The Guardian kindly featured it on a podcast to binge on during lockdown. So that's when my audience went from friends and family to people around the world listening. Anyway, back to the cricket. Paul Howarth, Grubby, was a listener. And we kept in touch and we had a bit of a chat. I knew he did, I think, the old Test match sofa back in those days.
Indeed, yeah.
And then it turned into guerrilla cricket. And I said to him probably about a year ago now, to be honest, I've always had a secret a secret yen to do cricket commentary. I've always said to my family, that's the one. We talked about ideal jobs, and I said, I'd really like to be a cricket commentator. That looks relaxing and fun.
You and several million other inner children of 50-year-olds.
That's very true. So again, we're talking about the people complain about social media and all of those things. So for me, overall, it's been a great blessing, because whether you call this social media or not, I don't know. But the technology nowadays, which allows me to do a podcast, but also allows the opportunity just doing exactly what we're doing now. And of course, guerrilla cricket's now gone sort of international. We do it via Zoom mostly. So I was given a bit of a tryout with the Indian series, I think it was a year ago, and obviously just about sort of was okayed by Hendo and the Bear, and just sort of been taking it from there, and I've enjoyed it enormously. Great. I actually went on Christmas Eve. I went round to Kat's house. She's in the same suburb, wow. And just met her neighbours and one or two other people who, like Jules, who sometimes does a bit of commentary as well. So that's another example of the community of cricket, and guerrilla cricket in particular, I guess.
Yeah, it was, as luck would have it, doing an interview with her in a couple of hours' time.
Oh.
I think that word community is a really important one in the context of what we do with guerrilla cricket, because it's, in some ways, it's about so much more than just cricket. It's about the people, and I think what sets guerrilla apart is the way in which people become a part of it, rather than just the passive listener. And certainly from my point of view, that's something I really enjoy.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Just back to my podcast, people often say, how are you going to make money out of it? Because people assume that that's the reason you do things. I say, I'm not interested in getting money out of it. I'm interested in forming a community. And it's the same with guerrilla cricket, isn't it? What else is there in life apart from friends and family in the end? As you get older, you to arrive at that conclusion.
Although I would say, as we're speaking, that notwithstanding all of that, guerrilla cricket actually does need money to stay on air. So I'd encourage people.
There is one difference. Yes, agreed. It does.
To contribute through Patreon, because although nobody gets paid, there are reasonably substantial expenses for us to meet in getting us on air.
Yes.
So just a couple of final things. Firstly, your favorite jingles.
Oh. Yes, that you've slightly blindsided me. I do. There was an Arctic Monkeys one, and I'm just trying to think who that's for. I like the Mark Wood one with the horse. That always just brings a smile to my face. I don't know why. I just really like Mark Wood. Yeah. And so can you tell? So those are a couple I really like. The Eat Sang Shi. I've never understood the origin of that.
Well, I understand. I may be corrected on this, and if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone will post in. I think that's Japanese for 1, 2, 3, 4.
I see. Okay. Okay. Well, there we are.
And our jinglers produce so many different ones. I was speaking to Perko yesterday. He's doing 50 jingles to mark a batter getting 50. He is so prolific and so quick in doing them. It's brilliant.
Is he? Are they typically guys who work in the sound industry, or are they just got an interest in making jingles? I'm never sure. I haven't.
They don't work. Well, sorry, I didn't get around to asking Perko what he does for a living, but I think he just loves what he's doing.
Yeah,
and he's, God knows, we get a lot of. Men with Ven works in the music industry. He records some fantastic stuff. But as far as Mog is concerned, no, he doesn't work in the area. I don't know about Sinel Peel. James Sherwood, obviously, who's responsible for a lot of the original jingles, is a comic genius, basically. He works as a comedian and singer. So, there's a huge variety. The one thing that I've discovered as I've talked to people is how many people involved with guerrilla cricket have also been involved in marketing.
Okay.
which would make you think we'd have a bigger following than we already do. But it's strange.
We really ought to be better at it. I mean,
Yeah.
Tony spent his whole life in marketing, hasn't he?
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to ask you is your most memorable cricket viewing experience, either test match or first class, whatever.
Well, there's a thing we talk about in advertising called recency,
Yeah.
where the things that happen to you, obviously most recently in life, tend to bubble to the surface. But it wasn't a live experience, but I was watching England crumble at Headingley in 2019 with my son. It was a great bonding experience. We used to stay up because in Melbourne, that was till 1 and 2 in the morning. We both had work in the morning at the time. And honestly, we were 80 runs adrift at Headingley. It was, I went to bed, and he's never forgotten this, but I couldn't get to sleep for half an hour. So, because I thought, you just never know. And it's always that. He was still up when I came back, and the great innings was just beginning to take shape with Jack Leach and Ben Stokes. So it was the innings. It was incredibly memorable, but it was also the bonding experience of doing it with my son at 2:30 in the morning. Something we'll never forget, I guess. You remember the cricket, but you also remember who you were with and all of those things as well, don't you?
The father-son thing is incredibly important. Tony Bishop said if he could have one day back at the cricket, it would be his very first test match when his dad took him to the Oval.
Yeah, there's one. I remember taking Jamie to Melbourne in 2006. That was his first day at a test match. And it was Shane Warne's 700th wicket,
Oh.
We always talk about that. Probably the most memorable live day was 4 years later in 2010 when we, I regret to say, shunted Australia out for 98 after lunch. And then Strauss and Cook were 150 for none at the close of play. We thought, I did say to him, you'll never get a better day's England test match than that. That will be, I've spoilt it for all time now. It'll never be as good as that again.
Yeah. Well, that's probably true. I mean, I'm not holding my breath for you to experience something like that in Sydney.
Indeed, no.
So I just want to say thank you very much for your time, Ian. And thank you too for your contribution to Gorilla. It's been lovely for, one of the silver linings from this pandemic has been finding new ways to do things. And what's happened for Gorilla Cricket is while we miss the camaraderie of the green room, those of us who are a long way away have an opportunity to participate in something that is pretty special. And it's just lovely having you as part of that family. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Messi. I echo all of those thoughts. It's a great community.